And the energy geopolitics that we had in the last 2 years wiped out most of the literature that we had before. And what we've seen in terms of the role of energy, the role of share revolution, and what it can do was beyond amazing. There was no way on earth that President Trump could have reimposed the sanctions on Iran in the fourth quarter of 2018. At the same time, imposes sanctions on Venezuela at the same time without the share revolution. There was no way on earth you will see that the EU today is united against Russia and standing up with Ukraine without a share revolution. And the irony here is, while the Biden administration and many of the leaders of Europe who are against oil and gas, and they are advancing policies to get rid of oil and gas, and they are bad-mouthing the industry, what they don't realize is their survival hinged on the US share revolution. It was the share revolution that saved Europe. It's the share revolution that enabled the Biden administration to stand up to Putin in Ukraine and Europe.
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Dr. Anas Alhajji, who's a world-renowned energy markets expert, researcher, author, and speaker. So Anas, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you.
No problem. I think we were saying it's been close to 18 months since we last spoke. So a lot has definitely happened in the world of in the world in general, but also in energy. So I guess from your perspective, can you maybe just give us a global overview of what's currently happening in the energy markets and what you're currently watching?
Generally speaking, when we talk about the oil market, we published our outlook in early January of this year. We worked on it, of course, throughout December. And we were fortunate that almost everything we did predict in that outlook happened, although it was against the grain at that time. There were two major issues in that outlook that we talked about, was that China's opening is not going to be a big deal. At the same time that Russia's production, oil production, is not going to decline that much as some people were predicting. And we hit the nail on both of them. However, we failed in that outlook to see that China was going to rebuild its SPR, that Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and build its inventories. We failed to see that. That changed the results of what we are seeing in the market today and what we are going to see in the next few months. We're very bullish on oil in the fourth quarter. We are still bullish, but not as bullish as before, simply because of the Chinese build of the SPR and inventories. And the reason why, because given the history of China, we know that they are going to buy this oil cheaply, and then they are going to withdraw it and sell it at higher prices to prevent oil prices from continuing to increase. And that's what we see in the market. Going forward, we know that the Saudis and the Russians been cutting production and cutting exports significantly. Today, in our daily energy report that we posted earlier today, we did talk about this. We put a chart showing that as of last week, the cut in the Saudi exports is 2 million barrels a day, which is a significant amount. Russia is cutting too much too. So that's going to affect the market. However, in today's report, basically, we brought up the idea that, okay, they cut, that's nice. We are seeing decline in inventories, that's nice. But all of this is going to depend on the situation in China. If China is going to have a recession just like Europe, or we are going to see a decline in economic growth, then those cuts are barely just meeting that decrease in demand. But what if China, as some indications that we are seeing now, that the economy is going to improve, and we see higher oil demand than what we've seen in the last 2 months? In this case, we are going to end up with a tight market. Again, it's not going to be as tight as we predicted in January, but it proves our point that things will be way better in the fourth quarter than the rest of the year. As for gas and LNG, people must understand one issue when it comes to gas and LNG, that if you have a problem in the Gulf of Mexico, like a hurricane, and all the LNG exported to Europe leaves the Gulf of Mexico. So if we have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico and LNG does not go to Europe, and let's say we are still in the middle of the season, but let's say we have several hurricanes, and even if they are non-damaging hurricanes, that means that those shipments cannot go to Europe. They are going to be at least delayed. So LNG prices in Europe and China and other places will go up. And now we have that strike in Australia too. That's going to push prices up anyway. But that's going to reduce gas prices in the United States. Why? Because it backs out all the gas in the pipelines. And if this lasts for a significant period of time, then producers have to shut down the gas wells in this case. So we end up with a situation where LNG prices, gas prices around the world are very high, and they are very low in the United States, and probably in some cases negative. And what that does is, once gas prices go that low, those who have contracts with the LNG plants benefit the most, because they are getting the cheap US gas, and then they are taking the LNG and selling it at the very high price, or the LNG plants themselves if they are selling in the spot market. So they benefit greatly from that. As we see it, Europe is still in danger, and next winter is still very difficult. Europe got lucky last year or last winter because we have a warm winter on one hand, and we did not have a significant or powerful hurricane season on the other in the summer, because again, that LNG goes to Europe. I think the listeners would remember those two numbers that I'm going to mention, or two percentages that I'm going to mention. The dependence of Europe on US gas is 40%. So 40% of the EU imports comes from the United States, and that's all LNG. But Europe still imports from Russia, and Europe dependence on Russia is 20%, which is half of the dependence on the United States. So 40 plus 20, that's 60. 60% of Europe's dependence is on Russia and the United States. And there is no other replacement around the world. And now with the strike in Australia, there is no replacement. We are already seeing Europe importing more Russian gas, whether LNG or pipelines. So the dependence on Russia, those who are talking about Europe basically is going to end up not buying any Russian gas, this is absolutely incorrect. And this might last for years. And if the war ends and the sanctions end, Europe will go back and buy more Russian gas. The world is not going to be the same. We are not going to go back to the old days. The US share in Europe of gas is engraved in stone. And people must realize that this is not the product of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This being planned long ago. If you go back and see what President Trump says, or other politicians says, or even Condoleezza Rice says in 2014, this was planned long ago. It just happened that the invasion of Ukraine expedited this and allowed the Russian Russian gas to lose to US LNG. So that's for oil and that's for gas. If you want to go to others, I'll be happy to, but I don't think we have plenty of time.
Yeah, it's interesting your last take there, because I think, as you said, probably the major beneficiary is the US. You know, they're one of the largest producers of oil, one of the largest producers of gas. So they've really gone in and, I guess, helped, you could say, help Europe, or benefited from that supply challenge they had there.
As a general comment, we have people who are specialists in energy geopolitics. And the energy geopolitics that we had in the last 2 years wiped out most of the literature that we had before. And what we've seen in terms of the role of energy, the role of share revolution, and what it can do was beyond amazing. There was no way on earth that President Trump could have reimposed the sanctions on Iran in the fourth quarter of 2018. At the same time, imposes sanctions on Venezuela at the same time without the share revolution. There was no way on earth you will see that the EU today is united against Russia and standing up with Ukraine without a share revolution. And the irony here is, while the Biden administration and many of the leaders of Europe who are against oil and gas, and they are advancing policies to get rid of oil and gas, and they are bad-mouthing the industry, what they don't realize is their survival hinged on the US share revolution. It was the share revolution that saved Europe. It's the share revolution that enabled the Biden administration to stand up to Putin in Ukraine and Europe.
That they might know, but they just maybe don't want to admit it. That's probably the issue. But if we go back to sort of, I guess, your first comment that you're making about the oil markets, as you said, the next few months, it sounds like most of the movements with supply and demand, or with demand at least, is going to be in China. So they're really going to have lots of control over both supply, actually, as you said, with their storage, as well as demand. So what is your base case in that scenario? What are you currently seeing?
We got to pay attention to two things here. First of all, why is China? Europe is already in recession. It will take time. Probably Europe will not even recover until the second quarter of 2024. For the United States, we are already around peak. We are seeing an uptick in oil demand, but it's measured. The oil producing countries historically used to add when oil prices are high, which means that when oil prices are high, the government spends more, their economy becomes more active, and their oil use increases. This time we are not seeing this. Why? Because they are being very conservative in their spending. So it's not the oil producing countries, it's not Europe. United States is again, it's measured. The rest of the world, basically their consumption is limited, and therefore their growth is limited. So we are left only with China right now. India, basically the demand for oil in India being flat, unlike what the media basically been talking about. It's been flat in India. So we are left only with China because of the decline in economic growth. That's on one side. But on the other side, last year, during the pandemic in China, we had the major lockdowns in China. At the same time, we ended up with the discounted Russian oil because the wish of the Russians basically to divert their oil and find other alternatives on one side, and the sanctions on the others. So they had cheap oil out there. At the same time, they have no demand. That gave them opportunity to fill up their SPR and to fill up their inventories. So they benefited from that. We thought that's done. Our mistake in our outlook that we published in January was, we thought that they were not going to build even more, and they did. They did add about 300 million barrels to what they had before. So they ended up with about 1.1 billion barrels of oil stored in China. That includes the SPR and the commercial inventories. So what China is doing basically is, now if we really end up with strong growth in the fourth quarter, they are already releasing oil from the inventories. So they are capping prices. And the statement we use in the office basically is, Saudi Arabia is going to set the floor because they are cutting, and China is going to set the ceiling because they are flooding the market with their own SPR, not SPR at this stage, but with their own storage. And I think that the China will release probably another 40 to 45 million barrels in the next 3 months or so to prevent oil prices from increasing. We will see where that's going to go. But even when they do that, they still have massive amount in storage. And we will see how Saudi Arabia and Russia will coordinate their own cuts. Today we heard Putin and Novak talking, and it seems probably there is a big surprise next week. We don't know, but the indication that there could be some new agreement between the Saudis and the Russians, and that might involve additional cuts. But we will see. The additional cuts means that as China reduces its storage, and now later on it wants to rebuild, it may not get the oil. Probably the Russians and the Saudis may not increase production to give the Chinese the chance to refill, because they know what China is doing.
It sounds like there's a chance of that having, just as you said, once China stop releasing oil and once the cuts occur, there could just be quite a lot of volatility to the upside quite quickly.
Well, the China issue here is they were getting cheap crude from Russia, no longer, because Russian crude now, or the price of Russian crude increased substantially, but they are getting almost all the Iranian exports at a very steep discount. So that's an issue, which means that if the Biden administration wants to hurt China, all they got to do basically is lift the sanctions on Iran, and then Iran now wants to sell its oil at the market price because they don't have to hide it anymore, and then the Chinese get stuck. And if Saudi Arabia and Russia do not export additional amount to refill the Chinese SPR or the Chinese storage, then the Chinese cannot play this game every year, because their idea is, now in the second half of the year I can use it, then demand seasonally decline in the first quarter of the year, then prices decline, I can refill in the first quarter and rinse and repeat. But if the Saudis and the Russians refuse to sell additional amounts while the Biden administration lift the sanctions on Iran, then the Chinese will get stuck with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I guess if we go back to, you said Saudi Arabia and Russia are going to have the floor. What price do you think that is? And I guess what ceiling price do you think China, what's their ideal prices?
Generally speaking, the Chinese, based on our studies, and this is over several years, our threshold that we thought was where China starts using oil from inventories was $75 for Brent. But we found out later that it was really around 70. It wasn't 75. So in a sense, our threshold was higher than reality. So it's about 70. The problem is, since last year, we've been having problems with our models because they were not able to predict this as it did in the past, for a simple reason. Because from the Chinese point of view, they are averaging oil prices from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and Africa, and others, and the United States, with the discounted Russian and Iranian crude, and we don't know what the discount is. We don't know what the price is. And therefore, since you don't know the price, we don't know where the threshold is. But still very close to what we are talking about. This year, if you look at what they've done, it was very clear that it was around 78 Brent. But once you include the Russian discount, probably it will go back to that 70 threshold again.
That makes sense. And I guess in terms of Saudi Arabia and Russia, what are they? Is their floor 60 or is it higher?
Well, it is really the floor that they are focusing on. They don't want prices to drop below a certain limit. If you look at what we've seen them react when prices touched around 70, 68 for Brent. We've seen them act and cut and make statements, etc. So the irony here is, it seems that the sellers and the buyers are behaving around that $70 threshold.
Yeah, it's interesting. So they're fighting against each other.
Yeah.
You mentioned there that if, I guess, the US were to go to Iran and do a deal, then that would be beneficial, I guess, overall, or at least for the US. But then I guess the challenge is that then oil prices overall would go up, wouldn't they?
I mean, Generally speaking, for the Iranians will go up, but not for the, so
Okay.
the Iranians will generate more, but for the world, it's not. It's the same thing. We published a report about 10 days ago, and we concluded that there was some indirect, at least indirect coordination between the Biden administration and the Iranian regime. And that indirect coordination led to the liquidation of all the floating storage of Iran. About 80 million barrels of oil be liquidated. So Iran does not have any more oil at all. Historically, the liquidation happened after reaching a deal. But now without a deal, it's been liquidated. And our view basically is the deal is already there simply for the following reasons. First, when it comes to the nuclear program, the Biden administration wants Iran to stay at the table in the negotiations in Vienna. So they cannot go and block their oil and the Iranians get mad and walk away and then reach a deal. Remember that candidate Biden, before the election, this was one of his center points for foreign policy. I want to go back to Jacoba. I want to go back to the Iranian deal that President Trump basically kind of missed out. So that was a promise before he became president. So it's an essential issue. But the Iranians basically are saying, look, if I'm going to have a new deal every 4 years, I don't want that. Either you give me a deal from the Congress that is permanent, or I'm not going to deal with you. So we have an issue here. So what happened is, to keep them at the table in the negotiations, they turned a blind eye to Iranian exports. So they did not enforce Trump sanctions. But the Iranians do not want to expose their deals anyway, so they kept it secret anyway, despite that fact. And then we have a green light given by the Biden administration to Venezuela and Iran, although they are under sanctions. The Biden administration basically allowed two companies, Eni and Repsol, to export Venezuelan oil despite the sanctions to Europe. Why? Because the idea here is they are not getting the Russian oil. We need a replacement. And OPEC and Saudi Arabia and others are not cooperating, and therefore I need other sources. So, and the Venezuelans need the money, or at least they need to continue producing and exporting, so they agree to it. So they got the green light. And then Iran got the green light from the Biden administration that if you export oil to Europe, I'm going to turn the blind eye. And we've seen the Iranian oil publicly basically being exported to Europe, and European nations who are against the Iranian regime were importing the Iranian oil. So because of that, for the sake of Ukraine, the Biden administration turned the blind eye to the sanctions. And then we had the negotiations regarding the prisoners, the 5 prisoners in Iranian jails. And again, to have those negotiations, basically, you need to turn the blind eye to the sanctions. Well, the Iranian regime and the people there who work for the Iranian regime are very smart. They took advantage of the system to the limit. So they increased their production, they liquidated their storage, and they are talking to every country they can sell to, but they ended up with a problem. The problem is the sanctions are still there. And the issue is Iran can export oil without any problems. And some countries basically can buy the Iranian oil, but they cannot pay them. This is a different story. They cannot pay them. And here I want to mention a very important point, that the Biden administration and the European leaders, when they imposed that price cap on Russia, on Russian oil, and they imposed the sanctions on Iran, etc., they understand that they don't want oil prices to increase substantially. So that's why they turned the blind eye to the price cap too, because they don't want higher gasoline prices. They don't want higher oil prices. They understand that. So, but the other side understand that too. So Putin understands that point, and the Iranians understand that point. So for the Iranians, the point basically they are trying to show here is, okay, I want to sell you my oil, but I want the money. And the other side will say, sorry, I cannot give you the money because the sanctions told me to put this money in an escrow account, and once the sanctions are lifted, you can take it. So no, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my oil in floating storage and other places, etc. I'm going to find a buyer who will give me either cash or do barter. And one of the ironies is barter is not included in the sanctions. That's why we've seen Iraq basically sign this mega deal with Iran, and it's a barter deal. And it's not subject to the sanctions because whoever drafted the sanctions forgot about that point. So Iran is basically saying, look, if you give me cash, I will sell you. You give me other things in return, I will sell you. And the only country can do that is China. And that's why most of the Iranian exports are going to China.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought. As you said, they'll do whatever they can to find their ways around these sanctions. So yeah, we've sort of put a price. You know, I guess China and the oil producing countries sort of want to be the price to be around $70. At the moment, Brent is closest. You know, it's at about $86. So is that why China is releasing oil from their inventories, and will it be enough to maybe push the price down, or does it really depend, as you said, on how strongly they bounce back?
Well, I think, of course, we don't have any hard proof on this, but I think that they understand that higher oil prices are not good for their economy. They understand that higher cost of energy inputs into their industries reduces the profits of their companies. So they want to make sure that prices stay within a certain range. In a sense, by using the storage and later on using the SPR, they are subsidizing every single industry in China. And when those industries basically sell their cheap products to the rest of the world, they are literally subsidizing everyone in the world.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put it like that. So you said you're mildly bullish. Does that mean you think Brent's going to go close to 100, or sort of do you have
we don't see 100 this year. Simply the Chinese are going to prevent that. At the same time, we have to remember that we do have those voluntary cuts. Voluntary cuts means things could change in a minute. There is no obligation at all to do anything. And we are already seeing some countries within OPEC increasing their exports in the last couple of weeks as prices increased, which means that cheating already started. So between China using its storage, between the cheating among OPEC plus members, the existence of the voluntary cuts that might change overnight, etc., all of this prevent us from having or reaching $100 this year. Of course, the whole idea here is unless we end up with a major political crisis in one of the major oil producing countries. So absent a major political event, we are not going to have 100 this year.
Okay, so yeah, so if we were talking on the 31st of August and we saw Gabon, which is an oil producer, and they had a coup d'etat, but that they're not a major producer, so that's not going to have a big impact on prices.
Speaking of Gabon, basically, it is a small producing country. It's an OPEC member, of course. It produces about slightly above 200,000. This is literally nothing. But what makes Gabonian oil insignificant to the market is that Gabon does not have any steady customer. It's not like there are customers who depend on Gabon, been depending on it for the last 20 years. The only steady customer Gabon has is China. And there are two things. We published this report yesterday or the day before yesterday. For those who are interested, they can check it out. And we pointed out two things that are, I think, two important points. All of a sudden, China stopped importing from Gabon at the end of June. They've been importing all along, and they've been the steady customer and the only steady customer. But why did China stop a month before the coup? That's number one. Number two, Israel used to import oil from Kurdistan. And as you know, last March, we ended up with problems with the pipeline going through Turkey, and then the exports were halted completely. That led to a halt of production, or most of the production, in Kurdistan. And still, the pipeline is not operational until today. And Israel basically lost its lifeline from Kurdistan. So what was the substitute? The substitute for some of that Kurdistani oil is Gabon. So Israel is the new customer to Gabon since last April. And now if the exports of Gabon basically are halted, then Israel has to find other sources. So they lost two major sources within 5 months. So the question is this, and I don't want to delve into the politics of it. I'm just raising the question here. Isn't it strange that the Israelis do not know about the coup and the Chinese know about the coup a month in advance? So they stop their exports to China?
Yeah, it's interesting when you when you put it like that. What do you think happened? Or no, you're not sure?
We don't know. I mean, just that
don't know.
I'm just looking at the data and those questions coming to mind. That all of a sudden, China never stopped importing from Gabon. All of a sudden, a month before the coup, just stopped. And Israel basically continued to import from Gabon. So if you want to go with this theory, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. It's just if you want to go with that theory, that means China knew about it and Israel did not know about it. And that's very strange when Israel does not know about it.
Yeah, it's fascinating when when you think about it. I'm sure we could go into the weeds there, but if we, I'm assuming that Israel won't have a problem replacing that.
So the bottom line on Gabon, and that's the result of the report basically, is there is no impact on the market, on the price level basically, and balances. There is no impact if we lose all the Gabonian oil. There is no impact at all, especially Gabon imports about 20,000 barrels of products from around the world. So the net is probably about 185,000 barrels. But that has no impact on the price level or balances. But it has an impact on Israel, and it has an impact on price differentials because most of the Gabonian oil is medium, and some of it basically is medium sweet. And therefore, it might affect the price differentials between the medium and the light. But overall, on the price level, the impact is limited, if any. And that all in that report that we published 2 days ago.
Yeah, and then say if there were to be further volatility in the region, and I know Nigeria is a large producer, Equatorial Guinea, if something were to, we have no idea what's happening, but if things were to happen in those countries, would that then have a more substantial impact?
If you study the history of the oil market, there is a very important observation that we have to keep in mind all the time. If you have a country with a very high volatility of production, which means that just like Libya and Nigeria, where production increases by 400 and then decline by 200 and then goes up by 300 all the time, etc., the market immediately within a very short period of time adjusts. And what they assume coming out of that country is the minimum. So whatever extra comes in, that's fine. But if you lose that extra, has no impact on the market. And we have over 30 years of evidence to support this point. So you have Nigeria and Libya. If we have changes in production, there is no impact on the market. But if you are talking about countries where they've been stable for a very long time, and we wake up in the morning and we lost 400,000, the impact of this 400,000 will be more than 400,000 lost from Libya or Nigeria.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure that's a lot of these experts being burnt previously in the past. They have to learn to, make sure that you take that into account.
And one more point, since I tweeted this morning, and I think it is very important for those who are going to hear this podcast to understand and focus on. One of the biggest mistakes we see in reports in the media by politicians even by analysts, by commentators on social media, etc. The source of that mistake that people think when we talk about oil and natural gas, that whatever we learned about in economics and that supply and demand, and that's all applies. That's not the case. In economics, we have a whole field called natural resource economics. It's completely different from any other field in economics. Natural resources, they have their own rules. And very few people understand these things. That's why we have all kind of wrong forecasts. And if you go and try to have a poll and you end up with, all kind of ideas and all kind, well, because most of them do not understand the theory of natural resources and what happened in the oil market and what happened in natural gas market, etc. This is a very important distinction to make. And the reason why I am saying this, because people have to realize, and especially those who are extremists when it comes to electric vehicles and renewable energy. And they think, we are going to wipe out this industry and we don't want any fossil fuel. We are burning it. We are doing this, you know the story. We are not against renewable energy. We are not against solar. We are not against wind. We are not against electric vehicles. In fact, I am one of the biggest supporters of electric and hydrogen vehicles if we use them in downtown areas for the purpose of cleaning the air in downtowns, not for cleaning the air somewhere else in another country. I am in support of that. So I support electric vehicles. I support solar. I support wind. But I am against the hype. Yesterday, I posted on Twitter all the companies that tanked. If you look at their stocks, they lost 85%, 60%. All of them major solar companies, so major wind companies. One of them that was Biden's favorite to produce electric buses went bankrupt, announced bankruptcy just 2 weeks ago. So we are against the hype. And the issue when we talk about oil demand and the substitutes is this. The substitution between renewable energy and oil is extremely limited. Why? Because renewable energy, especially solar and wind, produces electricity. We rarely use oil to produce electricity in OECD countries. That include North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea. But if you look at China and India, they barely use oil to generate electricity. It's less than 1%. Therefore, if they double renewable energy, they double its capacity or whatever, triple it, quadruple it, has no impact on oil, period. So you cannot say we are going to wipe out the oil industry because we are building wind turbines and solar panels. It's just nonsense. This is a fact of life. It has no impact because oil is rarely used in generating electricity. So we come to the transportation sector. That's where the issues are, is the transportation sector. When it comes to the transportation sector, people have to realize a couple of facts because we are talking about the depletable natural resource. If oil prices decline and decline substantially as we've seen in 2020, producers will continue to produce if they want to. Why? Because most of the cost is a sunk cost. Most of your cost is drilling a well, $8 million. If the well is dry, you lost your $8 million. Just putting the dirt back in the well does not give you your money back. That's gone. But if you produce oil, its sunk cost is gone. And therefore, when you have a decline in prices, what matters in this case is the operating cost, not the total cost. So yeah, you talk about shale and say, well, their total cost is $40, $50, whatever, pick up any number. And they are losing money. Yes, they are losing money, but they did not close down. They did not shut down. Why? Because their operating cost was $18. And if the price is 22, they will continue to operate. And then those guys, we go back to those supporters of EVs, etc. I say, those damn fools, they are lowering prices just to kill our industry and they are losing money. Well, no, it's the nature of the industry. That's what it is. Whether EVs exist or not, we've seen this even before we heard about EVs. The other issue is that if you look at the media, and if you look at the media report, specifically yesterday, there was a report that we commented on in our daily energy report, talking about this boom in electric vehicles in India. And therefore, global oil demand is going to decrease. Well, and then of course, emissions are going to decrease, and then climate change is going to be halted, you know, all the whole story. Well, that report, I'm not going to name the organization that published it, but it's a joke. Why? Because even when you go through the report, they are talking about motorcycles and three-wheelers. Well, they are not talking about the cars that when you say vehicle or a car, you think of like, you know, four-wheel car with at least 4 cylinders or the equivalent of that. We are talking about two-wheelers. We are talking about motorcycles. And it just happened that motorcycles and three-wheelers are the most efficient vehicles in the use of fuel that we have. We are replacing the most efficient. Anyway, if you convert every motorcycle in India, the impact on oil demand, global oil demand, is less than 0.001%. Nothing. And the impact on the environment basically is like 0.0002 or something like this in terms of reduction of CO2. Why? Because you are replacing the most efficient vehicles anyway. So when it comes to transportation, we have companies like CNOOC in China saying that China's oil demand is going to peak this year. China's gasoline demand is going to peak this year. Why? Because of the spread of electric vehicles. Well, look at the numbers. Why CNOOC in the first place? This is a Chinese company that's owned by the government. Why they come up with a report like this, and whom they are targeting with this report? There are about 245 million passenger vehicles in China. Let's say 250 just for the ease of use. Okay, 250 million passenger vehicles in China. How many electric vehicles they have today? Less than 15 million. So 15 million, and compare that to 245 million. And both of them are growing. Okay, so why gasoline will peak this year if they are all growing? So definitely there is a message there from the Chinese to the rest of the world. And why this message is important? Because everyone, you look at every country that we know, look at Saudi Arabia, look at UAE, you look at the big companies, everyone is preparing their package to go to COP28 in the UAE at the end of November with some numbers and some press releases and news media to show, look what I've done, look what I've done, look what I've done, look what I've done. Why all of this just happening just before a month or 2 months before the COP28 meeting? Because everyone is trying to get there. Why they are doing this? It's not to look pretty, by the way. They are doing this because that's the only way they can be on the table and change the narrative. This is the first time in history of COP, that COP, you know, since it started, we are 28, so there are 28 of them, where the oil companies basically are all present. So they have to show they are green enough so the other side can listen to them. And therefore they can change the narrative. So COP28 could be a historic meeting in Dubai simply because the narrative is going to change. And once this, and we will know by the end of the year basically what's going to happen. What is the result of it? The result of it is that the actual growth in demand for oil and natural gas and coal is going to be higher than forecasts. This is a very important point. If it's higher than forecast and no one is predicting that increase, except us, of course, because we are predicting that, then they will be shocked. And we are going to end up with energy shock or energy crisis simply because investors are planning on what is concrete forecast in their view, not on Anas Alhajji's forecast. And therefore, we are going to see a gap between supply and demand, and that will lead to a major increase in prices of all of them, oil, gas, and oil, gas, and coal. And there are no additional supplies to use at that time. We will go through a period of from 6 months to about 2 years, basically, of difficulty until we see the market responding and companies and investors responding to that.
And when do you think that would be most likely?
Well, we will know the result of the meetings by December, and then we can reassess and see how the narrative is already changing. You look at, especially the European oil companies, they all changed their narrative. If you look at the governments of Europe, they all changed their narrative, or let me rephrase that. They all changed their actions, but their narrative stayed the same. And the story that I always use, even on Twitter, that the European companies and some of the left in the United States are the leftist politicians in the United States are behaving just like the guy who wants to be religious, but he sins all the time. And he is afraid to be exposed. So he will act even more religious every time he sins. And Europeans in particular are doing that. Every time they burn more coal, you will see more statements about climate change. Every time they use more natural gas, you will see more statements about climate change.
Yeah, they don't seem to like to talk about those sort of things. So if we go to Europe quickly, I know we've already gone for sort of 40 minutes, but you're talking to before how you think that there could be challenges at the end of the year, especially if there's a exogenous factors such as hurricanes, Australian strikes, etc. A lot of people would say maybe, European storage, gas storages are already very high. They've had quite a low usage over summer, which is positive, and they'd say maybe they've prepared for the winter. Would you say maybe that's just wishful thinking?
First of all, the gas storage in Europe, the capacity in Europe is very small relative to their consumption. They really should build more storage. So it is small. Second, the assumption of full storage assume that the flow of gas will continue throughout. It's not like you stop the gas and depend on storage. So yeah, it might help you a few days if you are going to be cut off. But what if you are cut off? So yes, full storage, but still assumes a continuation of the flow of natural gas. But the issue for Europe is not only that. The issue is, what is the price? What is the cost? Most of the European countries today are in a recession. And they're spending, if you look at the IMF report about energy subsidies increased by $800 billion. $800 billion, most of it is in Europe, giving subsidies to fossil fuel that they've been fighting for 20 years. So the issue here is this massive increase in cost of fossil fuel as a result of a mixture of bad economic policies, bad environmental policies, and bad decisions on how to solve the problems. All of this put it together, everyone is paying the price there. One issue that people do not realize and that no one wants to talk about, that the living standards, especially last year, the living standards, including in Germany, went down. It went down. We're not talking only about income. I mean, if you are forced basically to warm up your home using wood that your grandfather used, okay, well, you did not do it because you like the smell of the wood and its luxury. And no, you did it because you are too cold and you have no choice. And you paid a very, very high price for that wood. So the losses to the European economies are not only the money on the books. It's not only the accounting losses on the books, because the living standards, no one until today counted the decline in living standards and what the cost of that. If I have to take 2 showers a week instead of 7, that's a decline in living standards. If I have to eat a cold meal instead of a hot meal just because to save on energy, then I have a serious problem.
Yeah, I agree. And if we look at, I guess, gas prices and other energies or products such as coal, maybe things that are more efficient, they sort of have a massive exponential jump during last year's winter, and now they've come down drastically. Do you see there being something similar, or will it maybe be a little bit smaller, or does it really just depend?
In general, I'm glad you mentioned this point, because we have a serious problem with the media in terms of reporting when it comes to renewable energy versus coal, oil and gas, and other things. And the logic is the same in both examples that I'm going to mention in a minute. We have the quarterly reports from the auto manufacturers, whether in Europe or the United States, Japan, South Korea. We have all the reports, and the reports basically are well detailed, and they show you the increase or the decrease in sales of every type of car, etc., etc. It's just a quarterly financial report that we know. So a company like Volkswagen, for example, or Ford or GM or others will issue the report. Now, instead of reading the report, you can read it through one of the major media outlets. So you start reading, okay, this segment increased by 10%, this segment increased by 2%, this segment this, and this brand basically helped this company, and the increase in the number of trucks helped Ford, all these things. And they show you the numbers, they show you the percentages. When it comes to the electric vehicle section, and this is very common, it's not even in Asia, it's not only in Europe and the United States. What do you see? Numbers disappear. You get only percentages. And it's not only one outlet or two or three. Most of the outlets basically do the same. Why? What is your problem? You reported all the numbers in the earlier sections. Why you are not reporting the numbers on EVs? And we have two examples that we focused on in a report about over a month ago on Ford and Volkswagen, basically, where several media outlets reported the increases only in percentages. But when it comes to the numbers, say the sales of this truck increased by 154%, and they stopped. Well, the sales of that truck, basically, the total sales was only 900 trucks, but they don't want to say 900 trucks, because when it goes to the same truck that runs on gasoline, the sales were 47,000. So you cannot say 900 versus 47,000. So you show the 54%. So that's one of the problems with the media, because the idea here is, if you are reading it and you say, this increased by 150%, this increased by 300%, this increased by 200%, you feel you are the only one who does not drive electric vehicle. But you look at all the numbers, they are really tiny by any measure. By any measure, they are tiny. Take now the same idea when we talk about renewable energy versus oil, gas, and coal. Because what you see in the media is, say, the capacity of solar in the United States doubled since last year. I'm just making this up just for simplicity. Doubled. That's capacity. Show me the generation. Show me the actual generation. Why no one is talking about the generation? Say, when capacity increased in Europe by threefold since 2015? Okay, but show me the generation. The reason why we have been suffering in Texas here for the last 3-4 weeks, and we were on the verge, basically, of the whole grid of collapse, simply because the percentage of generation from wind relative to its capacity is less than 10%. Why? Because the temperature was 107, 110. It's like between 43 and 45 degrees in Europe, the equivalent, or the Middle East. Why it's hot? It's hot because there is no wind. If the wind was blowing, the temperature would be lower. Therefore, I cannot use wind energy when the temperature is 45. So yes, I have this massive capacity that I built over the years, and capacity doubled since last year, but I am not getting anything out of it this summer. So the media basically is doing this favor to the community by focusing on the percentages without the numbers when they talk about electric vehicles and when they talk about only capacity, and they don't talk about generation when it comes to renewable energy. And that shows you the bias in one direction against the oil and gas and coal industries. I think we ran out of time here. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. No problem. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. So I guess what is one message you want people to take away from our conversation?
Well, the main issue that I think everyone should focus on that let the numbers speak. Let the numbers speak. The numbers are available. Let the numbers speak, and speak on behalf of numbers. Do not basically make up a story on your own or have your perception basically do it, or you get angry because the numbers do not match what you want. And we have to be on all sides. We have to be logical, because when we suffer, we all suffer from the same thing. When the power goes out, it goes out in my house and my neighbor's house and other people's house, with regardless of our views about climate change or electric vehicles, solar, wind, etc. We all are going to suffer. And therefore, we have to be logical. And the only common thread between us is to focus on the numbers.
Great
and
message.
Of course, I mean, for those who are interested, they can go back to our publications. We have the daily energy report, and we do have the newsletter, EOA newsletter. We discuss many of these things, but of course, with charts and numbers, etc. And I'm sure people will enjoy that.
Perfect. I'll put that on the description below, but thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.